Welcome to the Art of Procurement podcast with your host, Philip Eidson. Here, thought leaders share the trends, strategies, and tactics that you can use to elevate the role of procurement and your career.
Hi there, and welcome to another episode of the Art of Procurement. And today I welcome Scott Gillespie, and Scott is the CEO of AT Kearney onto the show. So Scott was an early member of the AT Kearney management consulting group that brought strategic sourcing and their 7-step process to the masses in the late 1990s. Through his work, he then became really passionate about travel, and he's since founded a number of different businesses focused on the management of corporate travel, with a particular focus on data and analytics, with AT Kearney being the latest of those businesses. And today's show is actually dedicated to corporate travel, and in particular, how procurement leaders can think differently about how to baseline and measure the success of a corporate travel program. Scott's thinking is based around the notion of managing outcomes, not savings, and it's really aligned with the conversations we've been having on the show about value creation, about value over savings. So if you have any role to play in the management of corporate travel, whether it's a category that you're directly responsible for, or maybe somebody on your team that you're responsible for is, then this is absolutely a must-listen show. But I would also recommend it if you're buying any type of service, and that you want to start thinking about how to measure value, as well as, if not instead of, cost savings. Because something that I took away is, Scott's thought process on how to identify value, how to understand outcomes, is something that you can apply to other categories. Even if the metrics themselves that Scott talks about in today's show are obviously different and are obviously dedicated to travel. Okay, well, with all that being said, I'm going to roll the tape. Hi there, and welcome to today's Art of Procurement interview. And as I discussed in my introduction, my guest on the show today is Scott Gillespie, and Scott is the CEO of AT Kearney. So, Scott, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Phil. It's good to be with you.
I'm great you could join us. And I went through a little bit of your background in my introduction, as I noted, but there's procurement and travel is weaved, in a number of roles that you've had over the past, I guess, couple of decades now. What came first? Was it an interest in procurement or was it an interest in travel?
It was an interest in management consulting.
Right.
Yeah. So when I joined Kearney, it was very much a general management consulting firm. Mm-hmm. But very shortly after I joined, they pioneered to a very large extent the fundamental principles of strategic sourcing.
Right.
And that became an extremely fast-growing, really important part of the Kearney consulting practice. It swept many of us into procurement strategic sourcing assignments. I became the first manager to manage a travel sourcing project for a major institution. And of course, in any consulting firm, the person who does the first engagement in a new field is the expert.
Right. You became an expert by default.
Yes, exactly. So I did become the subject matter expert in travel sourcing for the firm. And while I didn't work on it exclusively, that category, it was my favorite project to do. And then that's really what sparked my interest in focusing on the overlap, as you noted, between travel and procurement.
So what was it about travel then, once you did that first project, that you felt, this is something that I want to dedicate more of my career to, or this is something that I find interesting? Was it necessity of projects that just came to you through ATK, or was there did you make a concerted effort to stay within the travel field as it related to procurement?
Well, it was very easy to continue working on travel sourcing because it's such a popular category in any enterprise-wide sourcing engagement. You're likely to tackle travel either first because it's so high profile, or last because you're politically afraid of it.
Right.
But I have to say, I really, from the get-go, really enjoyed the category for a number of reasons. One, everyone can relate to it. Any consultant certainly can relate to travel, and most any business person is going to, relate to the travel category, the trials and tribulations.
And we all have our own opinions.
Yes, and we're all experts.
Yes,
as a result of those experiences. But it's also a category, and this was certainly true 20 years ago when I first got involved in it, and I think unfortunately it's still true today. It's a category that relies on very basic, low PQ data, and by PQ I mean procurement quotient.
Right.
There's very, very basic metrics being used. They really have not. The art has not advanced much, and because I'm drawn to analytical challenges by nature, I think there has been and still is a great opportunity to improve the procurement of the travel category by using more advanced analytical techniques.
And by understanding data and using data-based decisioning, I guess.
Yes, very much.
So, as you think, you mentioned that travel, and some context, so I've managed travel category back in the day as well, and it's funny when you said about it being very political. I've never had a category that I enjoyed probably as much as travel, but also that gave me as much hassle in terms of emails from travelers at 2 o'clock in the morning, asking me why Hertz won't give them snow tires, or why they can't go on a certain carrier or something like that. So
yes.
Lots of non-procurement work involved in it.
Yes.
You talked about the fact that a lot of travel programs are still kind of managing through relatively rudimentary data. But what are those? What are the key metrics that, for better or worse, any travel program still needs to have today?
So I'll parse your words just a bit. Needs to have. These are. I will describe the kind of the basic, again, kind of the low PQ metrics that are still pervasive and commonly used. So if you're looking for a starting point, let's look at a few things. Certainly, you have to know your spend in the major categories. So what is your overall air spend? Your spend on hotels, your spend on car rental. Those three subcategories of the travel domain will probably account for about 75% of your spend. So if you're looking for where to prioritize the spend management efforts, it starts with air, then hotel. Those actually one could be larger than the other depending on the travel footprint and characteristics, but then car is probably generally about 10% of air in most companies. So those three are the ones to tackle. The fourth to tackle, let's talk about metrics, sorry. So the key metric for air, the standard low PQ metric for air is average ticket price. You want to know that. For hotel, it's average room rate, and for car, it's average daily rate, the booking rate, whatever the rate is that you for a mid-size car. So those are the unit costs that you want to pay attention to, and then total spend. And then a very related metric is spend visibility, and that's simply a fraction. Take the amount of spend that goes through your travel management company, meaning you have full visibility of that spend, and divide it by the total T&E spend that shows up in your general ledger or across your expense reporting tool for a period, and that will give you some idea of how much spend is not visible, not easily visible. And you'd like to have that ratio be probably 75-80% or higher.
Right. And what's the best sources of data then? Is it from your travel management company or from your P card, your purchasing card or credit card receipts? Where do companies usually go to get that level of information?
Yeah, first and foremost, it is definitely the travel management company. Assuming that you have pretty high utilization by your travelers of the travel management company for the booking. And that could be the booking tool. There's most corporations ask their employees to use an online corporate booking tool, but that's backed up by the travel management company. The travel management company has visibility of all those bookings that go through the corporate booking tool. So collectively, you definitely want travelers to use the agency, and that data that comes through the agency is by far the most suitable for sourcing. It's the most suitable for policy decisions. It's the first and most important starting point for understanding travel data.
And so I recently interviewed Jimmy Ancalseria, and he's an expert on strategic cost management. And Jimmy was encouraging listeners to really understand the key cost drivers that influence the cost of products and services that we're buying. And there was a couple, I'm just going to start this bit again, to make a note here. So are there a couple of key cost drivers that you keep an eye on that impact, in the travel spend? And I know that this is pretty high level, but that impact the cost of travel. Is it, some commodity prices? Is it supply demand? What are the things that truly drive cost in travel?
Well, let's first talk about the impact of quality on travel. So it's obvious to all of us, you're going to pay more for a first class ticket than you will for a ticket in coach. You're going to pay more for a 5-star hotel than a 3-star hotel. So the first most important, most impactful driver of travel costs is the quality dial. You can just imagine a company choosing to dial up or dial down the quality of its travel, and that will have a direct impact on the travel prices that it pays. But within a travel quality category like coach class tickets or 4-star hotels, there are a couple of drivers that make those prices fluctuate. On the air side, the two most obvious ones are cost of jet fuel, which is roughly correlated with the price of oil, not real well, but that's, either of those are good proxies for what's happening as a major cost component to airfares. The other, if you're looking for a metric to predict what's going to happen with air prices, you want to look at airline seat mile capacity, scheduled capacity, future capacity.
Okay.
It's harder to get. It basically has to be purchased, or you can, but you can find how capacity is going to change, and change in capacity is highly correlated with change in prices.
So what I wanted to do today was really understand a little bit more about how we can think differently about travel, because, as a seasoned traveler myself, I know a lot of listeners are, we get very frustrated when we're driven into things just because of cost. And I always looked at things to say, well, my organization may have a policy that pushes me to do certain things, but those aren't actually the most productive things that I could do to get the most out of me on a trip. So cost is almost secondary, but it's obviously very difficult for an organization to kind of measure effectiveness on anything other than cost. So in your mind, why should we think differently about the way that we measure our corporate travel programs?
Yeah, mainly because the thinking about managing corporate travel hasn't changed much in 20 years. And I find that as good a call to action as any. If we've been doing something for 20 years, surely there's a better way to do things today.
Right.
And in fact, procurement executives understand what really should come more simply to the travel category, but for any number of reasons hasn't. And that's basically the application of the total cost theory, right? The total cost paradigm. So when you just spoke, Phil, about being frustrated at being asked by a corporate travel policy to do something that might not let you be as productive on your trip, that's a classic example of not considering the total cost. Right. So for the last several years, I really have been tilting at windmills, it feels like sometimes, but really trying to get the industry to think about organizing their principles of managing travel around the very basic, well-accepted paradigm of total cost. So what would that look like in the travel category? I think you have to start with some research that my firm and GBT, American Express Global Business Travel, and Airline Reporting Corporation just published on the impact of travel policies and important outcomes for travelers. So in a nutshell, the study shows that there is very clear correlation between the quality of travel policy, meaning is it friendly to travel policies, and if it is, you get more willingness to travel, you get less traveler friction, less burnout, you get better recruiting opportunities, you have stronger retention outcomes, and you have better trip outcomes. So it's becoming clear, because of some research like this and others, that you can spend more. Yes, your travel budgets may increase, but the business outcomes will also improve. And so it still is a management challenge to figure out what is the right balance between the size of the travel budget and the desired outcomes of travel. But we are making some progress in measuring those things.
I had a question. You mentioned something called traveler friction. I just wonder if you could explain a little bit about what that concept is.
Sure. So we've all experienced traveler friction. It really is the wear and tear of travel. Mm. So, and in fact, speaking of measuring, we do a nice job of measuring this because we can look at the itinerary of travelers. And in fact, we've done this for hundreds of thousands of travelers, and we can count things that we see in their itinerary. So, for example, the number of hours that a traveler is scheduled to sit in a plane, mm-hmm. The number of time zones that they cross during their trip, the number of nights they're away from home, the number of weekend nights that they're away from home, the time that they're spending on a plane outside of work hours, right? All these things matter. Certainly the cabin you're sitting in, and even to many travelers, the size of the aircraft. All these things are measurable. They're directional, and so we can tally them all up and measure a proxy for traveler friction, which we've done. And we actually have a remarkably robust database for benchmarking traveling populations against what the norms are.
So then how can you use that information then?
Yes. So the first step is to understand if you're interested in a particular traveling population, a company's set of travelers, we want to show you how your population's traveler friction score compares to the benchmark.
Yeah.
More importantly, we really focus on the road warriors because those are the people that are really susceptible to traveler friction and burnout and all the negative consequences. So we take a closer look at that, and then it becomes pretty easy to compare whether your travelers are traveling easier or harder, or more or less than expected by this very large database. So mm-hmm. we can point out whether or not you have higher or lower risk of burning your travelers out. Right. And from there, it becomes much more of an HR conversation, starting with those preliminary facts. You can simply go to HR and say, how important is talent retention to us?
Yeah.
Is it hard to recruit and replace road warriors, or is it easy? The harder it is, the more sensitive a company is to retention and recruiting of road warriors in particular, the more you would expect the company to support a traveler-friendly policy environment.
Uh-huh. And you said earlier about outcomes, about measuring outcomes of a trip. And how would you even go about measuring an outcome of a trip? Because I guess that's, a key baseline to then figure out how you can apply some of these other metrics to.
Yeah, absolutely. There is no easy way to measure outcomes. And while there has been a couple of research efforts at measuring ROI on travel, I personally don't put stock in the ones that I've seen. I think for any number of reasons. But so my approach that I think is actually very practical. Yes, you'll find this to be probably overly simplistic, but I think it's a good place to start, is to accept that we can't really measure the ROI on travel. Mm-hmm. So instead, let's look at the inverse, or the negative. Let's look at the scrap rate of trips. And in fact, in the survey that I mentioned, we asked these road warriors over the last 12 months, what was the percent of their trips that they would estimate to have been not worthwhile, not worth their time or the company's money?
Yeah.
And the average, and I'm sorry I don't have the statistic right here, but the average is somewhere around 12%, maybe mm-hmm. plus or minus 3 or 4%. But simply asking that question retroactively, in hindsight, what percent of your trips would you rate as being not effective? I think that's a good, not great, but it's a good starting point for monitoring overall the idea of getting the most that you can for your travel spend.
Right.
And if that number goes down, great. And if the number goes up, you probably need to be asking why. And no matter what the number is, as long as it's measured, we all know people will begin to wonder about how to make it better. Yes. And that's really the spirit in which I think the travel category needs to move, is to take that motivation to try to reduce the scrap rate of travel.
Yeah, try and at least measure things, like you say, so then that can drive new behaviors, or at least drive an attempt to improve the metrics that you are measuring.
Yes. Yes, which I hope you'll ask me about some of the other metrics that I...
Yeah, and in fact, that was next on my questions. I was actually going to ask because obviously there's more to it than just a couple of things, and I am interested to understand what other metrics can we start to think about in travel.
Yeah, so in addition to understanding the scrap rate of travel, which it was one of the 4 new metrics that I'm calling for the industry to adopt as fundamentally important. So scrap rate is one for the reasons I've explained. Another really important, and I think not debatable metric that we need to formulate is the traveler risk management score or index, or however you want to think about it. But basically, travel programs have a duty of care. It's a legal obligation based out of the UK law, but it's been adopted now across North America as just making sense, and there are some legal ramifications. But the point is that travel managers have a duty of care to protect their travelers while on the road, and there are some really good frameworks for assessing how well a company is prepared to manage this duty of care and manage the risks associated with traveling. I think that those frameworks can be condensed into a scorable system so that any company should be able to quickly score itself on its preparedness, if you will, and on its travel footprint, meaning the companies that send travelers to oil fields in Nigeria should have a higher risk score than the investment bankers that spend time in Geneva. Right. So take that concept, it should be obvious that, yes, we should be measuring our preparedness and our footprint, and we should be all aware at a senior management level of what our traveler risk management score is, and we want to improve that over time.
What are some of the things then that you can do in terms of risk preparedness for a traveler that would go into, giving you scoring well on a metric like this?
Yeah, so first, maybe most fundamentally, is know where your travelers are.
Yeah.
And for any traveler that books through the corporate travel agency and the online booking tool, that's really fairly easy. It's when they don't book, when they book on Kayak or Orbitz or American.com So there's a visibility issue that's probably first and foremost. Second is to integrate with a risk management company that is monitoring what's going on in all these destinations that your travelers are at or going to, both for political unrest and for natural disasters. And third, that you've got some backstop, if you will, for dealing with the inevitable disasters, emergencies, medical situations that will come up, and how are you going to extract your travelers from those situations in a healthy way. So those are some of the ways, and that's just really covering the tip of the iceberg. There's a lot more that companies really need to pay attention to, but that should get your listeners started to think about the right issues.
Right, and then to think about what they can do to mitigate some of those risks too on the back end.
Yes, exactly.
So you mentioned 4 different metrics. We covered a couple of them. I wonder if you could share the next one that you had in mind.
Yeah, this one is, again, should be obvious to anyone thinking about who's traveling, and it's really focusing on the road warriors. And the metric is simply measuring the attrition rate of your road warrior population.
Yeah.
So that's an easy one to do. Just a matter of identify those road warriors, and if you're looking for a single classifier of road warriors, I would suggest it's nights away. I use 35 nights away a year as the test for qualifying as a road warrior. Whatever companies choose is fine, but just understand who's been traveling a lot, and go to HR and ask them, of this long list of people who have been our road warriors over the last 3 years or so, how many are still here? That gives you the attrition rate. Ask the HR person one more question, which is, how expensive is it to replace one of these folks fully loaded? And then take those 2 facts to senior management and just ask them, are they okay with this attrition rate and this cost to replace? And if they are, then that's an indicator that no changes may be needed to the travel policy.
Right.
If management is alarmed or concerned about those facts, then you should follow up with a really interesting discussion about how to change the travel policy and the travel culture to reduce the attrition rate and reduce the cost to replace.
So I had a question that came out and that jumped up, and then we can go into the last one after it, but it's kind of related. And it was, you talked about road warriors, and road warriors at least being in your mind 35 nights away a year. Can you, or have you seen organizations have policies or travel policies where there are actually different rules for road warriors versus those that travel infrequently?
Yes, so there are a few, and I think it makes perfect sense. I'm surprised, actually, Phil, that this is not a much more popular way to apply travel policies. If you think about laptops or computers, anyway, do you think engineers have better laptops and desktops than the salespeople do? Of course they do. It's because they need the computing power. Mm-hmm. So road warriors should be treated the same way. They need better, more accommodating, more traveler-friendly policies because, in fact, their productivity is so tied to their traveling experiences and the amount of time they spend on the road. It should be obvious they need more accommodating travel policies.
Yeah, it's something I've never even thought about before. But when you think about it, it seems obvious that I know there's difficulties then in terms of, I mean, you have as much experience as I have of travelers who maybe travel once or twice and, kind of have a lot of expectations. So there may be difficulties in managing it and managing expectations. But it just seems to make sense that those that you're expecting, that you're putting under the most pressure from a travel perspective, should have the opportunity to have some benefits of doing that, to encourage them to continue doing it and to also then manage some of those things like attrition. Yes,
absolutely. Absolutely. So you might find some of these stats interesting. I'm going to do these off the top of my head, but they're pretty close. The average road warrior spends maybe 250 hours in a plane a year. That's the scheduled time. That's not including time in the airport or delayed on the tarmac.
Yeah, waiting for your gate at LAX.
Yeah, so that's remarkable. That's a lot of hours that they're in a plane.
Yeah.
They're going to spend probably 80 nights a year on the road. I mean, this is a lot of time away from the office, away from home, that just really has to impair their productivity. You would think that companies would want to make sure if they're going to travel that much, a company should find ways to counter those negative productivity environments and help them be their best.
And the relative cost of doing that is pretty small compared to the impact that it has on their productivity, but also attrition and everything else that happens with, people not really feeling as though even being tired because they're traveling too much. The lost time in hours of that is far greater than it is, bumping up a couple of $100 to be able to travel on a different class of travel or something on a domestic flight.
Well, that's it. You've captured the essence of the challenge for management, is to make that decision. And what I'm very critical of our industry for not doing is taking some basic facts into account, mainly because those facts haven't been surfaced or built in any robust way. But because of the survey that I mentioned, we're beginning to do that. We have a remarkably robust database now on traveler friction, so we know what that looks like. We're getting closer to the point where it should be easy and standard for travel category managers to use a total cost approach. Right. And frankly, it's a much more interesting discussion with senior management when you can go to them and say, let's look at the whole picture here. Let's be a little bit more strategic about how we want to deploy these oftentimes tens or hundreds of millions of dollars that companies spend on travel. What are we really getting for that? What's the business benefit of this? And can we shape that to be even a higher benefit to our company? And the answers are emerging that, yes, you absolutely can.
So what was the last metric then of the four that you talked about?
Yeah, so the first three that we've talked about, Traveler Risk Management Index or scoring, attrition rate, and scrap rate, those are all gauges, right? Mm-hmm. They tell you outcomes. They tell you what's happened. This fourth one is the dial, that I think is the one that's most important to understand, that this is the one that companies can influence very quickly and very directionally, and that is measuring the quality of a trip. So what does that mean? Practically speaking, I think it means two things. It means measuring the flight quality and the hotel quality. Let's think about hotel first because it's so easy. Just measure the star rating of the hotel brand that your travelers are staying at.
Yeah.
Right. So that's very easy to do. Any travel manager can do that, and you'll come up with an overall star rating, which is now useful for understanding why your average booking rate, your hotel room rate, is going up or down. Well, perhaps it's tied to the quality of the hotel, and if so, that ought to be revealed by measuring the hotel quality over time. But it's also an important function to realize that, again, in the study we've done, it's clear that trip quality is more important to travelers than trip quantity, meaning you'll burn people out less if you give them better quality trips. It's not as important the quantity of trips that they take. So upgrading a travel policy to a nicer class of hotel will have good outcomes on the business side. The other component is flight quality, and that's a little harder to measure, but you can think about doing it in a couple of very basic ways. One is simply estimating or using the on-time arrival rate of your airline suppliers. That's a decent starting point. I think that should be included. You certainly want to measure the number of nonstop flights that they offer in your markets, and probably to some travelers, the gauge or size of the aircraft is important. So larger aircraft are more preferred to smaller aircraft. And in fact, since this podcast will be published after the speech I'll give, we will announce in conjunction with the company Flight Stats that T. Claire and Flight Stats are going to provide for free a flight quality score covering the top 500 domestic U.S. markets. So we'll give the industry a way to start measuring flight quality.
And so things like seat pitch and preferred location, whether you want an aisle or a window seat, things like that, can that play into, or is there a way of capturing that data rather seamlessly and applying that to a trip quality score as well?
Yeah, the key word is easy.
Right.
Yes, so there are Flight Stats, between Flight Stats and another third-party airline reporting corporation, they do have the ability to show a company very specifically what's gone on with their travelers and measuring down to the traveler their flight quality experience, on time, delays, disruptions, which cabin they sat in, lots of good stuff. It really is just a question of how fine do you want to try to measure trip quality, so there are those things. Wi-Fi on board has to be considered. Even luggage space, right? The overhead luggage space is probably a factor to many road warriors. So there are a lot of things that can be measured. It's just a question of how easily can you integrate the data and how customized do you want to produce a score for any one company?
Yeah, and I was asking those because I'm thinking what's important to me. And you said something earlier about trip quality, how it's not necessarily the amount of times that you travel, but the quality of the trips that you take. It's completely resonated with me because I'm not as concerned about how much travel I would have to do, so long as, if it's actually a nice experience, it's just a part of the work week, and I don't think anything particularly bad of it. But then if you're feeling like you're being pushed into an airline you don't like, or you get the middle seat, or you got somewhere with really poor pitch so you can't work using your laptop, all those things contribute to whether you think of it as being a chore or something that's perfectly acceptable.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, based on the survey we did, we asked road warriors what they want. The top 5 requests of these road warriors, I think I'm going to do this in the right order. First was nonstop flights, right? They don't want to be forced to take an extra connection. Bad things happen with connections, right? So there's that. Business class seats on flights over 6 hours was important. Better choice of hotels. So not necessarily better hotels, but better choice. They want more freedom to choose their own hotels. More time off after long bouts of work, and access to premium economy seats on domestic flights. Right. So the order might not be right, but those are the top 5 issues for travelers. And what I find interesting is that if you look at that list, yes, some of those things, not all of them, but some of those things will cost more money. But they really are quests by the travelers for more productive ways to travel. Yeah. They'll sleep better. They'll have more productivity on the aircraft. They'll have less time in transit. I think it's it really is telling us that road warriors really do want to be productive on the road, and they're asking for those policies to help them do that.
And something else that's interesting that came up. So I think, when I look at where I'm guilty of not going through my travel management company in previous roles, it's to do things like get a premium economy seat, where you may be able to get a premium economy seat at the same price as an economy seat, but you can only do it if you go directly through the website. Then I go through the website and I won't go through the TMC, and so you're actually missing that data for a number of different reasons, both in helping you negotiate with your carriers, but also in knowing where the traveler is. So there's some things you can do to be more flexible that will actually have a positive impact on your program, rather than driving people to do things on their own out of policy.
I fully agree with that. Absolutely. That is, it's like you're reading some of the trade press. Those are issues that are front and center today.
Yeah. So when I bring this back to procurement, so procurement is often managing the travel program, and we're often measured purely on cost savings alone, which is, I think, one of the reasons why you're still seeing those pretty basic metrics being used, because it's an easy way for us to demonstrate the impact or otherwise that we have on the program, however realistic those metrics are, because it's also, again, about the benchmark, and I could go down a whole nother line of how accurate benchmark information is that you're applying those metrics to. But how can we start to use some of these new metrics in lieu of cost savings or costs, and kind of convince the people who pay our bills, the CFOs of this world, that this is the right way to measure the travel category?
Yeah, so I'll be a little heretical here. I think measuring savings is smoke and mirrors. I think there's no good reason to measure savings. Put it this way, you can't correlate savings with business benefits.
Right.
You can't say, because we've saved more, we now have a better recruiting stance for road warriors. We're going to have less attrition because we've saved more, we've got more productive road warriors. Maybe you have, but there's no correlation between the two, and so I'm uninterested in measuring savings. What I do think is important from a procurement perspective is to understand what the price gap is between the tickets that you buy in your markets, your city pairs, the markets you travel, and the average corporate price paid in those same markets, weighted for where you travel. What's the difference? What's that in a percentage basis? That's only a starting point.
Right.
And then what you really should be doing is breaking that price gap down into its two major components. One is the product mix, meaning how much of that price gap is due to the types of tickets that your travelers have chosen to buy. Have they chosen a nonstop flight? Did they choose a first class ticket? Did they buy 7 days in advance? Tell me about the characteristics of the ticket, because that definitely influences the price. And then tell me what the procurement impact is on that price gap. Have you done as well as the average in the market? Are you better than the market average on your procurement, or are you worse? Tell me those two things, and then you can begin managing appropriately. So managing savings per se is not interesting to me if I'm thinking about what are the metrics that I can manage to influence the program.
Right.
So set savings aside for a moment and just imagine a trend chart, right, over months or quarters. But what you need to be measuring is your price gap. You need to be measuring your attrition rate of your road warriors. You need to be measuring the quality of your trip. And you need to be measuring the scrap rate.
Yeah.
So do those things over time. And if you want to put in budget, compliance to budget or budget to actual, some other metric, fine. You need to take all those features, those metrics into account in a holistic picture. I mean, that's the fundamental concept of total cost, right?
Right.
Look at the whole impact on the business, not just the amount that you're paying your suppliers.
So as we look to start to wrap up here, I had a final question, and we talked about this a little bit before, that a lot of procurement organizations that I've come into contact with, they've done a really good job at managing corporate travel management, but it's often from a pretty tactical perspective. And we've talked about measurements and metrics. But what would you recommend to a procurement leader or a category manager in travel? What should they start thinking about doing if they want to become more strategic in the way that they manage the category?
Yeah, so this is exactly the same problem that many HR executives have faced over the last 10 or 20 years, because they too have been oftentimes viewed as a very tactical, not strategic resource in the company. I'm afraid travel category managers are viewed the same way, very tactical, not strategic. So very aligned with what we've talked about. The way to take a more strategic role in this category is to connect the dots between road warrior costs and road warrior outcomes, specifically attrition, willingness to travel, trip scrap rate. Those are three good ones to start thinking about as outcomes, as impacts, and measure those, and just continue to challenge management with, do we have the right balance?
Yeah.
And that, just asking those questions and bringing some very basic facts into the conversation will, I think, do wonders for elevating the value that a travel category manager can add.
All right, well, thank you very much, Scott, for the time that you've spent with us today. And there's some really interesting things here from travel. And I say that, I mentioned before about managing the travel category before, and I always felt that I was just managing on cost and managing to reduce the quality of trips, I think, in everything I did. Not deliberately, but that was ultimately the effect of trying to save money without really seeing the bigger picture. So I think it's really important to kind of, and this is applying to not just travel, but to any category that we buy, to take a step back and think about the outcomes, not necessarily the, what we may do on a tactical level to try and manage cost. And so, very last question, probably the easiest one, or hopefully the easiest one of the day. That's, where can listeners contact you if they'd like to find out more, or if they'd like to continue the conversation?
Oh, sure. Please contact me through LinkedIn or on our website at tclara.com, tclara.com. Another resource is Gillespie's Guide to Travel and Procurement. It's a blog that I've written for the last probably 6 or 7 years. It's got a wide range of topics, certainly covers traveler friction, the metrics that we've talked about, and a lot of other very travel procurement-related issues.
Great. Well, what I'll do is I will link up to tclara.com. I'll link up to your LinkedIn profile at the show notes for today's episode. Those are going to be at artofprocurement.com/travelmetrics. That's artofprocurement.com/travelmetrics. So, Scott, just for one final time, thank you very much for joining me.
Yeah, real pleasure, Phil. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to another episode of The Art of Procurement. To find an archive of all past episodes, you can go to artofprocurement.com/episodes. And to ensure you never miss another show, go to artofprocurement.com/subscribe.